Hey, this is Chris. Welcome to another episode of San Diego's Historic Backcountry. Today I wanted to take a quick look at some of the interesting kind of aspects of the Stonewall Mine and its history. A lot of people are familiar with Stonewall Mine, having gone there and looked through the fence at the different relics that are still laying on the ground there and everything. A couple of interesting features to Stonewall Mine, though, that I thought we'd go over, and a couple of things that still remain from that you can see to this day, the date from different periods in the Stonewall Mine history. So come along and let's take a look at the history of Stonewall Mine and the history of its unique aspects that are still somewhat visible today. So if you spend any time in Cuyamaca Rancho State Park at all over the years, you've probably driven over to Stonewall Mine, the little parking lot there, read the sign and peered through the fence at the old machinery. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the kind of unique aspects of Stonewall Mine, go over some historic photos and kind of what we're seeing in them as well, and then what kind of vestiges of some of that equipment and everything are still lying here on the ground. So let's take a look at the history of Stonewall Mine real quick. So right after gold was discovered in the Julian area, about 1869, very quickly ranchers and people who were farming and ranching in the backcountry started to keep an eye out for gold-bearing quartz like they were finding over in Julian. One of those people was William Skidmore, and William Skidmore was grazing horses and cattle on the meadows at Cuyamaca, and this is where his grazing camp was, over here in a kind of a little side of one of the main meadows in Cuyamaca. And William Skidmore discovered the gold-bearing quartz at Stonewall Mine. So William Skidmore didn't really have the resources to develop Stonewall Mine. He very quickly took on a couple of partners from Julian area, and then actually didn't even own the mine for very long after that. He sold out very quickly. And what we're looking at in this photograph are the early sort of 1870s developments of Stonewall Mine. You see the head frame up there on the hill is very vertical, has a big ore bin off to the side of it there. You can sort of see the horizontal boards on the beams on the ore bin. And the stamp mill is going to be over here on the right with the pitched roofs angling off to the sides. So during the 1870s, the Stonewall Mine employed a fair number of people. These are the earlier workings. You can see that big ore bin up there right at the top center with all the sort of cribbing on it. That's going to disappear here pretty quickly. Also at Stonewall Mine in the 1870s started developing a little village just down on the north side where there were some houses for the workers and for the mine foremen. This would get greatly expanded, well, at least somewhat expanded in the next few years. And then by the early 1880s, the Stonewall Mine was sold to Robert Waterman, who within just a year or two would become the governor of California. He was kind of a mining baron in California in those years. He had owned several different mines out in the Mojave Desert and such as well. Waterman put a lot of money in the Stonewall Mine, improving the facilities there. This is the later version of the head frame enclosure. You can see it doesn't have the big ore bin sticking out anymore. And then the stamp mill down there to the right is completely redesigned as well. The older stamp mill building stayed for a while next to the later one. He expanded the stamp mill and added more stamps into it to increase the capacity of the mine. Most of the heavy equipment for Stonewall Mine was actually hauled in from quite a ways away. I believe these stamp mill batteries say San Francisco on them, so they were probably brought down the coast on a steamship and then hauled inland by freight wagon. So very equipment-intensive industry hard rock mining was, especially in the 1870s, 1880s. And then in this photo, we see Waterman's rebuild of the hoisting works up there, and then the stamp mill the stamp mill extension that he built, and then that white building on the right was that original stamp mill from the 1870s. So the hoisting works at Stonewall Mine and the stamp mill were all steam powered, which required a huge amount of wood. It was all wood fired, and required a huge amount of wood to burn to make all that happen. We'll talk about the water situation coming up a little bit in the video here. But the Stonewall Mine had its own sawmill, had a whole crew of people, of men who were hauling logs down off of Cuyamaca Peak and North Peak to bring lumber down to the mine to cut both for firewood and for mine timbering. So Stonewall Mine had its own little sawmill right there on the property where they were cutting up these logs. And in this 1880s view of the stamp mill, you can see what looks like a wall or big bank back there in the background, almost looks like a rock wall. That's actually a huge pile of firewood back there stacked up on the hill. That's about where the picnic area is now. Huge amounts of wood that were stockpiled to run the steam boilers for the Stonewall Mine. The underground workings of Stonewall Mine also required a huge amount of timber for the timber framing within the mine shafts and the mine tunnels underground. Stonewall Mine got down to about 600 feet and had several different elevations cutting off to the sides of the main vertical shaft. And during the years that Waterman owned the mine, the settlement down the hill, by then called Cuyamaca City, it didn't necessarily grow a lot, but it's got a little bit fancier. Governor Waterman had a little bit larger house than the former owners had. And then this was the hotel. This was the Cuyamaca Hotel down there. I believe this is looking down on the house right there in the lower center with the fence around it. That was his house. They called it the governor's house at Stonewall Mine, but he didn't really live there. It was more his son, Waldo, was actually the mine foreman for quite a while. He probably spent more time in the house than Robert did. But Cuyamaca City had a school and had that hotel, big barns down there, blacksmith barns and everything. So it was a pretty good operation to support the mine and the people who worked there as well. So let's take a closer look at a couple of interesting machinery items that we can still see vestiges of today. When we think of a mine hoist, usually this is what we think of. This is actually a modern one. A big wide drum with a round cable that goes up over the head frame and pulls the mine cars up and down out of the mine. Just kind of a big spool is what it is. In Stonewall Mine, it was actually quite a bit different. The mine hoist at Stonewall Mine was a pair of hoists next to each other. And the cable, instead of being a round cable, it was a flat, kind of a big ribbon of steel that was braided. And you do see them at different places in the West, but they were kind of rare. It was a more unusual way to do it. So let's mark up that same photo here of the hoisting works at Stonewall Mine and point out a couple things. Upper left, where it says flat cable, that's the cable angling up from the hoist drum down below. It's going to go up over the head frame. There's another one to the right over there as well. On the right, instead of that big drum, that big spool, where it says cable spool stack, what that is the flat sort of ribbon of cable. Instead of having to have a huge drum to put on, they just stack it up like a big, like a spool of ribbon where it just goes over the top of itself. So that's what that is. It's a cable spool stack. That's the cable. It's just a big flat stack of it, and it's a holding in place. You have those guides sticking out that you can see actually going all the way around, almost like a ship's steering wheel, with these posts sticking out. And that's what guides the cable and keeps it in a nice big flat stack like that. Kind of an unusual situation. Usually you have those round cable, the typical braided cables, but Stonewall Mine had a flat cable. And then, of course, when we peer through the fence today, there's a whole bunch of that cable, that sort of ribbon of steel cable still laying on the ground in there. Stonewall Mine had a vertical shaft straight down to about 600 feet level. So the main ore was hauled out of the mine in big buckets that were hung on that cable. So there's also a couple of buckets within this mine enclosure display area out there. The big piece of metal in the back is a flue from the one of the steam boilers. And then up at the top of the head frame, to change the direction of that flat cable from the hoisting works to direct it straight down into the mine, there were two big pulley wheels up there that just spun freely. And they're actually both still laying on the ground here at Stonewall Mine. Yeah, you can see the one here, and then the other one's actually sort of underneath it in the pine needles. But you can see where instead of being a V-groove pulley, it's a big flat belt pulley because all it has is that flat cable going over it. So a completely different shape than what you would usually see with a bunch of pulleys in a regular round cable mine. So kind of a unique little aspect of Stonewall Mine equipment is the flat cable, and you can still see different pieces of that around. So the next aspect I want to talk about is the tailings piles of Stonewall Mine. This is another 1880s photos, kind of hard to see from across the lake here, but if you notice all that white ground up rock that's coming down toward the lake there. That was the main tailings pile that was coming out of the stamp mill and the expanded stamp mill as well. They just dumped the tailings right down in that little drainage that sort of led right down toward the lake. That was the main stamp mill tailings pile. Now, right up by the mine, in the area where the little mine cabin display is today, you also see all these tailings piles. This is a bit further up the hill, right up where the hoisting works was. These are actually the waste rock piles. This was the rock that was taken out of the mine to get to the ore. So there's no real ore in here. This is all the rock that was sort of the overburden. They had to get out of the way, and they had to tunnel through. But when you walk around in this area, you can see all this kind of unusual hummocky-looking ground back in here, where they dumped all the waste rock. Just right off the end of the mine shaft there, but it did not go down into the stamp mill. So the third tailings pile for Stonewall Mine is actually on the south side of the parking lot. It's what you drive by on your way into the main little parking area there. This tailings pile, which is actually the easiest one to see, is from ore that was reworked during the 1890s from the main stamp mill tailings that were down there by the lake. We saw in that historic photo. These tailings were brought back over the hill and were treated in a different chemical process that was then able to extract more of the gold that had not been recovered in the initial stamp mill process. And these are the tailings from that generation. So you actually have 3 different tailings eras or types at the Stonewall Mine. This area, like I say, is a lot more obvious when you're driving into the Stonewall Mine parking lot. This area down below on the south side. So as I mentioned before, the machinery at Stonewall Mine was steam powered. There's still several of these big flues from the boilers laying on the ground up there. The water for Stonewall Mine pretty much came from the mine. These mines had to continuously pump water out that was seeping into the mines to keep from flooding. So they really didn't need wells or anything to gather water. They had plenty of it coming out of their own pumps just to keep the mine open. Where do you store that water, though? That's what's interesting at Stonewall Mine, is right up on the very top of the hill, we're going to find the remnants of how they stored the water for the boilers at Stonewall Mine. So up on the very top of the hill above Stonewall Mine are the ruins of the Stonewall Reservoir. This is fairly interesting. This also saw use later on as the water tank for a Girl Scout camp that we'll talk about in another video. So this kind of has 2 different eras of use. But the original brick reservoir can be seen here. It's really quite large. This is 60 feet across. And I believe the rock work on the outside is probably CCC that was put on to kind of protect it and enclose it when it was used as a Girl Scout reservoir in the 1930s through the 1970s. But the Stonewall Reservoir is still up there. It's behind a chain link fence, as you can tell. You can't get too close to it, but it is a very interesting feature. It was roofed over until the Cedar Fire in 2003 burned the roof off. And it's kind of interesting because it didn't look very impressive back when it had a roof on it. All you saw were these little rock walls and a big sloping sort of pyramid roof sticking up. Now that it doesn't have the roof on it anymore, you can see just how big it is and how deep it is. It's probably about 10 feet deep in there, so that's why they keep it fenced off very carefully. But another hidden gem of the Stonewall Mine, hidden behind a fence up on the top of the hill. So thanks for joining me in another video looking at San Diego's historic backcountry, and I will see you in the next one.